The gavel came down like thunder in that sterile conference room, and suddenly my entire world collapsed into a single sentence. There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the current filing. 46 years of marriage, reduced to legal jargon. But when Attorney Morrison's shoulders started shaking with barely contained laughter, I knew something was terribly, beautifully wrong with Victoria's perfect plan. My daughter-in-law had orchestrated what she thought was the perfect heist of my husband's $55 million empire. She stood there in her designer black suit, pearl earrings catching the fluorescent light, looking every inch the grieving widow she'd never been. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was wearing the same pearls I'd given her for Christmas 3 years ago, back when I still believed family meant something. But Charles had been planning too. And what Victoria didn't know was about to change everything. I should have seen it coming the moment Victoria arrived at the hospice with her rolling suitcase and that clipboard. Charles had been fighting pancreatic cancer for 8 months, and I'd been by his side through every chemo session, every sleepless night, every moment when hope felt as fragile as morning frost. But Victoria? She showed up for the final act with organizational charts and estate planning pamphlets. "Margaret, you look exhausted," she'd said, setting down her Louis Vuitton bag with practiced precision. "Why don't you go home and rest? I'll handle things from here." Handle things. As if my husband of 4 decades was a business transaction requiring proper management. The irony wasn't lost on me that Victoria had barely visited during Charles's 8-month battle with cancer. While I was sleeping in hospital chairs and learning to navigate insurance claims and treatment protocols, Victoria was building her law practice and maintaining her social calendar. She'd send flowers occasionally, with cards signed by her assistant, and she'd call every few weeks to check on the situation, as she termed Charles's fight for his life. But as Charles entered hospice care, Victoria's interest suddenly intensified. She began showing up daily, armed with legal pads and manila folders, discussing practical matters and future planning. She'd arrive when I was at my most vulnerable, during medication changes when Charles was barely conscious, or late in the evening when exhaustion had worn down my defenses. "Margaret, we need to be realistic," she'd say, settling into the chair I'd been occupying for months. "Charles may not be thinking clearly about financial matters. The medication, the stress, it affects judgment. That's why it's so important to have someone with legal expertise involved." She'd speak about me as if I weren't in the room, addressing Charles directly about my supposed limitations. "Your wife is going through so much right now. The emotional burden of managing complex financial matters after you're gone could be overwhelming for someone her age. I think we should streamline things, make them simpler for her to understand." Charles was a brilliant aerospace engineer who'd built his fortune designing guidance systems for commercial satellites. We'd started with nothing but his engineering degree and my faith in his quiet genius. Together, we'd weathered failed prototypes, rejected patents, and lean years when we lived on ramen and dreams. When his breakthrough finally came, a revolutionary stabilization system that every major aerospace company wanted, we celebrated in our tiny apartment kitchen with champagne we couldn't afford. That was 38 years ago in Denver. I'd been fresh out of college with a degree in mathematics and a job at the local bank, managing loan applications and conducting financial analysis for small business owners. Charles had come in seeking funding for his first patent application, nervous and eager, with a briefcase full of technical drawings that most loan officers wouldn't have understood. But I understood. I saw the elegance in his equations, the practical applications of his theoretical work. I approved his loan when 3 other banks had turned him down, and we spent the next 2 hours in the bank's conference room, discussing how satellite technology could revolutionize communications. "You're the first person who's looked at my work and seen the possibilities instead of the problems," Charles had told me that day. 6 months later, he proposed in that same conference room, joking that it was where we'd first became partners. Now we lived in Phoenix, in a house overlooking the Sonoran Desert, surrounded by the success we'd built brick by brick. or so I thought. Our house had become a shrine to our shared achievements. The walls were lined with framed patents bearing both our names, photographs from industry conferences where we presented our work together, and awards recognizing our contributions to aerospace technology. Charles had always insisted that I be listed as co-inventor on patents where my mathematical analysis had contributed to the design, and he'd made sure I was included in all professional recognition. But Victoria seemed to see none of this evidence of our partnership. During her visits to the hospice, she'd make comments about Charles's achievements and his legacy, as if I'd been merely a spectator to 46 years of collaboration. One particularly painful conversation occurred during Charles's final week. Victoria had arrived with yet another folder of documents, this time containing what she called legacy planning materials. She spread them across the small table in Charles's room, speaking in the low, urgent tones of someone discussing state secrets. "Charles, I've been working with my team to ensure your intellectual property is properly protected," she said, not acknowledging my presence even though I was sitting right beside his bed. "The patents alone are worth millions, and the ongoing royalty streams need sophisticated management. I think we should establish a trust structure that can handle the complexity." Charles, weakened by medication but still sharp, had looked at her with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What about Margaret? She's been managing our finances for decades." Victoria's smile was patronizing, the kind reserved for children who don't understand adult conversations. "Of course Margaret will be taken care of. But these are sophisticated financial instruments, Charles. They require professional oversight. Someone with legal and financial expertise." I'd wanted to speak up, to remind Victoria that I'd been analyzing complex financial structures since before she'd graduated from law school. But Charles caught my eye and gave the slightest shake of his head. At the time, I thought he was trying to avoid conflict during his final days. Later, I would understand that he was already planning his response to Victoria's manipulation. The funeral was held at St. Matthew's Cathedral downtown. Victoria had insisted on the venue. Charles deserved something befitting his stature, though Charles had always preferred the small chapel where we'd renewed our vows on our 25th anniversary. Everything was pristine. White lilies arranged in perfect symmetry. A eulogy delivered by a minister who'd met Charles exactly twice, and a reception afterward at the Phoenician resort that felt more like a networking event than a celebration of life. I stood in the receiving line, shaking hands with colleagues and distant relatives, while Victoria worked the room like a political candidate. She introduced herself as Charles's estate manager to people who'd known her for years, as if she'd suddenly acquired credentials that elevated her above mere daughter-in-law status. The most telling moment came when Charles's old business partner, Frank Morrison, no relation to the attorney, approached me with tears in his eyes. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. Charles was like a brother to me. If there's anything you need, anything at all." Before I could respond, Victoria materialized beside us. "Frank, thank you so much for coming. I've actually been meaning to call you about the aerospace consulting contract. We should discuss transition protocols soon." Frank's face shifted to confusion. "Transition protocols? I thought Margaret would be." "Oh, there've been some changes to the estate structure," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "Nothing to worry about. I'll be in touch." Frank glanced between us, clearly uncomfortable, then squeezed my hand and walked away. That's when I realized Victoria wasn't just organizing Charles's funeral, she was announcing her coronation. Later that evening, back at our house, Victoria busied herself packing Charles's belongings with military efficiency. I watched from the doorway as she folded his favorite sweaters, the ones I'd knitted during his recovery from his first surgery. Each item was categorized: donate, keep, discard. I felt like I was watching someone dismantle not just his possessions, but the physical evidence of our life together. "Margaret," she said without looking up, "I've been thinking about the house situation." The house situation. Our home of 23 years had become a situation. The market is quite strong right now, she continued, placing his reading glasses in a box marked Donate. With your age and the maintenance requirements, you might want to consider something more manageable. A nice retirement community, perhaps. I know a wonderful realtor who specializes in estate transitions. I wanted to speak, to remind her that this was my home, that every wall held memories she couldn't pack away in boxes. But exhaustion had settled into my bones, and grief had stolen my voice. I simply nodded and retreated to the kitchen, where Charles's coffee mug still sat in the sink, unwashed since his last morning at home. In the days following the funeral, Victoria's presence in my life became increasingly invasive. She'd arrive at my house each morning with coffee and pastries, settling in at my kitchen table with her laptop and legal pads as if she'd taken up permanent residence. She spoke in soothing tones about practical matters and necessary transitions, but her actions felt like a systematic takeover of my life. "Margaret, I've been thinking about your financial situation," she announced one morning, spreading documents across the table I'd shared with Charles for 23 years. "Managing Charles's estate is going to be complex. There are patent renewals, royalty distributions, investment portfolio management. It's really a full-time job that requires specialized knowledge." She'd paused dramatically, as if waiting for me to acknowledge my inadequacy before continuing. "I think the best approach would be for me to handle the technical aspects while ensuring you receive appropriate monthly distributions. That way, you won't have to worry about the complicated details." What Victoria presented as kindness was actually a carefully orchestrated campaign to position herself as indispensable while simultaneously undermining my confidence in my own capabilities. She'd mention complicated tax implications and sophisticated investment strategies in ways that suggested these matters were beyond my understanding. But I'd been managing complex financial matters for decades. I'd analyzed Charles's first patent applications for commercial viability, negotiated licensing agreements with aerospace companies, and made investment decisions that had grown our modest savings into a substantial fortune. Victoria knew this history, but she was betting that grief and exhaustion would make me forget my own competence. During these morning visits, Victoria would also share concerns about my well-being that felt like subtle accusations of incompetence. She'd mentioned that I'd seemed confused during a phone call with Charles's doctor, or that I'd forgotten an appointment I'd never actually scheduled. These fictional incidents were delivered with expressions of loving concern, making it difficult to challenge them without appearing defensive or unstable. "I'm worried about you, Margaret," she'd say, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "Grief affects everyone differently, and sometimes it can impact our judgment and memory. There's no shame in accepting help during this difficult time." The gaslighting was subtle but persistent. Victoria would reference conversations I didn't remember having, claim I'd agreed to arrangements I'd never discussed, and express surprise when I questioned decisions she claimed I'd approved. She was building a narrative of my declining competence that would justify her eventual takeover of Charles's estate. One particularly manipulative incident occurred when Victoria brought her assistant, Elena Rodriguez, to the house. Elena was a young woman fresh out of law school, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but following Victoria's lead. Victoria introduced Elena as someone who would help organize Charles's papers and ensure that important documents weren't accidentally misplaced. Under the guise of helping, Elena began cataloging Charles's professional files, removing original documents and replacing them with copies. When I questioned this process, Victoria explained that the originals needed to be secured in a proper legal environment to protect their integrity for estate processing purposes. I watched helplessly as 40 years of collaborative work was systematically removed from my home and relocated to Victoria's law office. Patent applications that bore my signature as co-inventor, financial records that documented my role in building our wealth, correspondence that revealed my involvement in Charles's professional relationships. All of it was being secured in a location where I would need Victoria's permission to access my own history. "This is just temporary," Victoria assured me as Elena loaded boxes into her car. "Once the estate is properly settled, you'll have access to everything. I'm just making sure nothing important gets lost during this transition period." But I was beginning to understand that Victoria's definition of temporary and mine were very different. She was constructing a situation where she controlled access to the evidence of my partnership with Charles, making it difficult for me to prove my integral role in building our shared success. The most disturbing aspect of this process was how Victoria managed to make her actions appear caring and responsible. To any outside observer, she was a devoted daughter-in-law helping a grieving widow navigate complex practical matters. The manipulation was so skillful that I began to question my own perceptions and wonder if I was being paranoid or ungrateful. During one particularly difficult conversation, Victoria suggested that I might benefit from professional counseling to help process my grief. She'd already contacted a therapist who specialized in late-life transitions and could provide support for adjustment challenges. The implication was clear. My resistance to her help was evidence of emotional instability rather than legitimate concern about her motives. Dr. Williams has extensive experience helping widows adapt to new circumstances, Victoria explained, sliding a business card across the table. She understands how overwhelming financial responsibility can be for someone who's never had to manage these matters independently. The assumption that I'd never had to manage these matters independently was both insulting and false, but Victoria delivered it with such confidence that it felt like established fact rather than biased opinion. This was the most insidious aspect of her manipulation, the way she presented her distorted version of reality as objective truth. As these daily visits continued, I found myself becoming increasingly isolated from the support network Charles and I had built over the years. Victoria would screen my phone calls, explaining that she was protecting me from unnecessary stress during my vulnerable period. She'd cancel appointments with friends and colleagues, claiming that I was too tired or not ready for social interactions. When our longtime financial advisor, Robert Sterling, called to schedule a meeting about the estate, Victoria intercepted the call and rescheduled it for a time when she could attend as my representative. She explained to Robert that I was overwhelmed by the technical complexity of the financial situation and needed professional guidance to understand the implications of various decisions. I began to feel like a prisoner in my own life, watching helplessly as Victoria constructed a cage of caring concern that was designed to justify her control over every aspect of my existence. She was building a case for my incompetence while presenting herself as the responsible family member who was stepping up to protect me from my own limitations. I arrived 15 minutes early, but the conference room was already occupied. Victoria sat at the head of a mahogany table that could have seated a corporate board, surrounded by men in dark suits and one woman taking notes on a laptop. I recognized none of them. "Margaret, perfect timing," Victoria said without looking up from her documents. "Please take a seat." The only empty chair was at the far end of the table, separated from the others by an expanse of polished wood that made me feel like a defendant facing a tribunal. There was no coffee waiting for me, no packet of documents, no acknowledgement that I'd been married to the man whose estate we were supposedly discussing. Victoria cleared her throat and began reading from a bound document. Her voice was crisp, professional, devoid of any emotion that might suggest we were family. She outlined Charles's assets: the aerospace patents worth $23 million, investment portfolios totaling $18 million, the Phoenix house valued at $2.3 million, commercial properties in Scottsdale worth $4.2 million, and a collection of smaller properties and business interests that brought the total estate to $55 million. As she spoke, I found myself remembering how we'd acquired each asset. The patents came from countless nights in our garage workshop, where Charles tinkered with prototypes while I managed the paperwork and correspondence with potential investors. The investment portfolio grew from my careful research and his technical insights. We'd been equal partners in every decision. The house was chosen together after months of weekend searches, looking for the perfect view of the desert sunset Charles loved to photograph. Then came the distributions. Victoria had inherited the patent portfolio and business interests. Charles's nephew David, a man who'd visited exactly 3 times in 20 years, received $5 million in liquid assets. The local aerospace museum got $2 million for a new wing to be named in Charles's honor. Various charities received smaller amounts totaling another $3 million. I sat in my chair, waiting for my name to be called, waiting for the acknowledgement of 46 years of partnership, of being the woman who typed his first patent application on an old Remington typewriter because we couldn't afford secretarial services. But my name never came. When Victoria finished reading, the room fell silent except for the soft humming of the air conditioning. One of the suited men, I later learned he was Victoria's associate, James Chin, finally spoke up. And regarding Mrs. Whitmore's share of the estate? Victoria didn't even blink. There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the current filing. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not a single asset. Not the house we'd chosen together. Not a dollar from the fortune we'd built. Not even Charles's collection of vintage engineering textbooks that I'd helped him acquire over decades of weekend bookstore visits. That's when I heard it, a sound I couldn't immediately identify. Soft at first, then growing stronger. Attorney Morrison, Victoria's own junior partner, was struggling to contain what appeared to be laughter. His shoulders shook, his face reddened, and he kept glancing at a manila folder in front of him. Victoria noticed too. "Morrison, is there something you'd like to share?" Morrison cleared his throat, but the amusement didn't leave his eyes. "I think, well, perhaps we should discuss the secondary documentation." "What secondary documentation?" Morrison opened the manila folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "The addendum Mr. Whitmore filed with our office 6 weeks ago. The one he specifically requested I handle personally." The color drained from Victoria's face. I reviewed all final documents. There was no addendum. "With respect, ma'am, you reviewed the documents you prepared. This was filed separately, through my direct channel, per Mr. Whitmore's explicit instructions." Morrison turned to me with something approaching reverence, his demeanor completely transformed from the professional detachment he'd shown throughout Victoria's presentation. When he spoke, his voice carried warmth and respect that had been entirely absent from the proceedings until that moment. "Mrs. Whitmore, your husband came to see me privately in January. He was concerned about irregularities in the estate planning process. He wanted to ensure certain protections were in place." He slid the document across the table toward me, his movements careful and deliberate. As the paper moved across the polished mahogany surface, I felt as if Charles himself were reaching across the divide between life and death to place something precious in my hands. It was Charles's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable, written in the blue ink from the pen I'd given him for his 65th birthday. "To whom it may concern, I, Charles Robert Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby establish the following irrevocable addendum to my last will and testament. All assets currently assigned to Victoria Whitmore in said will are hereby transferred in their entirety to my beloved wife, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, in recognition of her equal partnership in building our shared fortune. Victoria Whitmore is to receive a sum of $50,000 as acknowledgement of her professional services during my illness, and nothing more. This addendum supersedes any and all previous arrangements. Signed and witnessed this day, January 15th, 2025. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in that conference room. Victoria's carefully composed mask finally cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. Her face cycled through emotions, shock, disbelief, rage, fear, like someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "This is impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The dates don't align." Charles was heavily medicated in January. This document is invalid. But Morrison was prepared for this challenge. His smile widened as he opened another folder, this one significantly thicker than the first. He was clearly enjoying this moment, having waited months to reveal the extent of Charles's preparation. Mrs. Whitmore, your father-in-law specifically anticipated that challenge. He asked me to arrange for Dr. Patricia Vance, his oncologist, to witness the signing. She provided a written statement confirming his mental capacity at the time. I also have security footage from our office showing the entire process. He placed Dr. Vance's letterhead statement on the table, followed by a DVD labeled Whitmore Estate, January 15, 2025, Conference Room A. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Charles had not only protected me legally, but he'd anticipated every possible challenge Victoria might raise. Furthermore, Morrison continued, clearly savoring each revelation. Mr. Whitmore expressed concerns about potential coercion in the estate planning process. He specifically mentioned feeling pressure to make changes that didn't reflect his true wishes. Victoria's hands were trembling now, her professional composure completely shattered. You can't, this isn't legal. I'm his daughter-in-law. I'm family. Morrison's expression hardened, his voice taking on the cold authority of someone who'd been waiting months to deliver this particular verdict. You're also an attorney who attempted to manipulate estate documents through undue influence and potential fraud. Mr. Whitmore was very specific about your motivations and methods. He withdrew one final document from his folder, a letter in Charles's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. This wasn't a legal document, but something far more powerful, a husband's final message to his wife, written with the clarity that sometimes comes to people facing death. Morrison's voice became gentle as he read Charles's words aloud. Margaret, if you're reading this, it means my suspicions about Victoria were correct. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you directly. I needed to be certain, and I needed to protect you from the confrontation I knew would come. Victoria has been pressuring me to change our estate plan for months, claiming it was for tax efficiency and legal protection. But I realized she was planning to cut you out entirely. I've known Victoria since she was 25 years old. I watched her work her way through law school with determination I admired. I supported her career, her ambitions, even her marriage to my son David. But somewhere along the way, that determination became something darker. The truth is, our son David left her last year. The divorce papers were filed in October, but Victoria asked me not to tell you because she was handling it privately. What she was actually doing was positioning herself to claim inheritance rights through manipulation and emotional coercion. She used my illness against me, Margaret. She waited until I was weakest, until the pain medication made me vulnerable, until grief had stolen your voice. She counted on our love for each other to make us easy targets for her scheme. I've been pretending to go along with her revisions while secretly working with Morrison to ensure you receive what we built together. Every patent, every investment, every asset, they belong to you, just as they always should have. Victoria will fight this. She'll claim fraud, mental incapacity, undue influence. But Morrison has everything documented. The truth has a way of surviving, even when we don't. You are the love of my life, the partner who made every success possible. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't let anyone write you out of the story we created together. All my love, Charles. By the time Morrison finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief, vindication, and overwhelming love for a man who'd protected me even from the grave. Charles had seen what I'd been too trusting to recognize, and he'd saved me from a fate that would have erased 46 years of partnership. Victoria had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup now a stark contrast to her ashen skin. The other attorneys were already gathering their papers, distancing themselves from what had clearly become a professional and personal disaster. Morrison stood, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. This meeting is concluded. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore is the sole beneficiary of the estate, effective immediately. Mrs. Victoria Whitmore, I suggest you consult independent counsel regarding your position. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. Her composure finally cracked completely, revealing the desperation that had been driving her actions. This isn't over. I'll fight this every step of the way. You have no idea what you've started. But Morrison was already standing too, and his smile had turned predatory. He'd clearly been anticipating this threat as well. Actually, Mrs. Whitmore, I think you're the one who doesn't understand the situation. Your attempts to manipulate estate documents are well documented. Your emails to your paralegal about removing Margaret from the succession timeline are particularly damaging. Your systematic isolation of Mr. Whitmore from his support network has been documented by multiple witnesses. He paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering his final blow. I'd be very careful about making threats in this room. You're already facing potential disbarment proceedings. I wouldn't recommend adding extortion to your list of ethical violations. Victoria's face went from white to red to white again, like someone experiencing rapid changes in blood pressure. She grabbed her briefcase with shaking hands and stalked toward the door, her heels clicking angrily against the marble floor. At the door, she turned back one final time, her mask of professional competence completely gone, replaced by raw fury and desperation. This was supposed to be simple, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. He was dying. She's old. It should have been easy. Those words hung in the air long after she left, revealing everything about how she'd seen me, not as Charles's partner or his widow, but as an obstacle to be removed. An inconvenient old woman who could be easily manipulated out of a fortune she'd helped build. But Victoria had underestimated two crucial factors: Charles's love for me and his engineer's mind that planned for every contingency. As the door slammed behind her, Morrison turned to me with a gentle smile. Mrs. Whitmore, your husband was one of the most thorough clients I've ever worked with. He anticipated every possible challenge to his plan and prepared countermeasures for each one. You're not just protected legally, you're protected completely. I sat in that conference room for several more minutes after everyone else had left, holding Charles's letter and trying to process what had just happened. In the span of an hour, I'd gone from being erased from my own life story to being restored as its central character. Charles had given me more than my inheritance back. He'd given me my identity, my dignity, and proof that our partnership had been real and valued, even when I'd begun to doubt it myself. The laughter Morrison couldn't contain that day in the conference room. It was the sound of a beautiful plan finally coming to light, the moment when Charles's faith in justice proved stronger than Victoria's faith in manipulation and greed. As I finally stood to leave, I realized that this wasn't just about money or assets. It was about love, partnership, and the power of someone who truly sees you fighting to ensure you're never made invisible. Charles had won his final battle, and he'd won it for us. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and emotional recalibration. Victoria tried, of course. She filed challenges, claiming the addendum was forged, that Charles had been manipulated, that I had somehow coerced Morrison into fabricating evidence. She hired 3 different law firms and spent nearly $300,000 in legal fees over 6 months. But Morrison had been thorough. He had medical records, security footage, testimony from Dr. Vance, and a paper trail showing Victoria's attempts to manipulate estate documents dating back 8 months. Most damning of all, he had her emails to her legal assistant, discussing removing Margaret from the succession timeline and streamlining beneficiary structures. The investigation revealed a pattern of manipulation that went deeper than I'd ever suspected. Victoria had been intercepting mail from Charles's financial advisors, redirecting calls from his attorney, and gradually isolating him from his support network. She'd convinced him that I was too fragile to handle estate planning discussions, that she was protecting me from unnecessary stress. In reality, she'd been building a case for my incompetence, documenting every moment of grief-induced confusion, every time I'd forgotten an appointment or mixed up dates during Charles's treatment. She'd planned to use these instances to support a claim that I was unfit to manage a large inheritance. The first major break in the investigation came when Morrison discovered Victoria's assistant, Elena Rodriguez, had been keeping detailed records of all the suspicious activities. Elena was a recent law school graduate who'd been troubled by what she witnessed, but afraid to speak up initially. When approached by investigators, she provided a timeline that was devastating to Victoria's defense. I started noticing things weren't right about 3 months before Mr. Whitmore passed, Elena testified in her deposition. Victoria would have me draft documents, then revise them multiple times to remove Mrs. Whitmore's name. When I questioned it, she said it was for clarity and legal precision. But it didn't feel right. Elena's testimony revealed that Victoria had been forging Charles's initials on document revisions, claiming he'd approved changes during phone calls that Elena knew never happened. She'd kept copies of the original drafts, showing the progressive erasure of my involvement in the estate planning. Even more damaging was Elena's account of overhearing Victoria on a phone call with someone she called my financial advisor. During this conversation, Victoria had laid out her timeline for transitioning the widow to a smaller role and discussed liquidation strategies for the estate assets. She was treating it like a business acquisition, Elena said. Not like she was dealing with a grieving family. The divorce papers Morrison mentioned revealed Victoria's true motivation. She'd already lost half of David's assets in the settlement. Charles's estate was meant to be her safety net, her ticket to financial independence. She'd calculated that a grieving elderly widow would be easy to manipulate, that I'd accept whatever scraps she offered out of family loyalty. She was wrong about that too. During the legal proceedings, I learned more about Victoria's financial situation. She'd been living well beyond her means, maintaining the facade of success while accumulating debt. Her law firm was struggling, and she'd been using client funds for personal expenses, a practice that came to light during the estate investigation. The financial audit revealed that Victoria had borrowed against her law firm's operating account to maintain her lifestyle during the divorce proceedings. She'd also taken out several high-interest loans using future inheritance expectations as collateral. The estate scheme wasn't just about greed, it was about survival. She was facing bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for client fund misappropriation. Morrison uncovered another disturbing detail. Victoria had been researching my health records through her law firm's investigative services. She'd obtained medical reports from my annual checkups, looking for evidence of cognitive decline or health issues that might support a claim of incompetence. When the report showed I was in excellent health for my age, she'd begun documenting instances of concerning behavior during Charles's illness. These fabricated concerns included claims that I'd become increasingly forgetful, emotionally unstable, and unable to make sound financial decisions. She'd even gone so far as to schedule a lunch meeting with our family doctor, Dr. Sarah Chen, to discuss her worries about my mental state. Dr. Chen's notes from that meeting, subpoenaed during the investigation, revealed Victoria's true intentions. Daughter-in-law expressed concerns about Margaret's ability to handle complex financial matters after husband's death. Suggested evaluation for early cognitive decline. No medical basis for concerns noted in patients' recent exams. Dr. Chen later testified that she'd found Victoria's behavior unusual and manipulative. In 40 years of practice, I've never had a family member come in with such detailed concerns about a patient's mental state when my own observations showed no cause for worry. It felt like she was fishing for a diagnosis that didn't exist. The State Bar Association opened their own inquiry into Victoria's conduct. Within a year, she'd lost her law license and faced criminal charges for client fund misappropriation. The inheritance scheme wasn't just about greed, it was about desperation. But perhaps the most revealing discovery came from Charles's personal computer, which Morrison had seized as part of the investigation. Hidden in encrypted files were recordings Charles had made of his conversations with Victoria during the final months of his life. He'd suspected her manipulation and had been documenting it. In one particularly chilling recording, Victoria could be heard saying, "Charles, you have to think about Margaret's future. She's going to need professional management of these assets. The responsibility would be overwhelming for someone her age. It's really an act of kindness to handle this for her." Charles's response was barely audible but clear. "Margaret has been handling our finances for 40 years. She's the smartest person I know." Victoria's reply sent chills down my spine when I heard it. "Well, that was when you were there to guide her. Things are different now." The recordings revealed a systematic campaign to undermine my capabilities and isolate Charles from his support network. Victoria had been playing a long game, positioning herself as the responsible family member while painting me as incapable and fragile. As the legal dust settled, I began the process of truly understanding what Charles had left me. The patents alone generated substantial annual royalties, and the investment portfolio had been expertly managed to provide steady growth. But more than the financial assets, I discovered a treasure trove of personal documents Charles had preserved without my knowledge. In a safety deposit box I didn't know existed, I found every letter I'd written to him during our brief long-distance period early in our marriage. There were photographs from our travels, ticket stubs from movies we'd seen together, and a small notebook where he'd recorded his favorite moments from our life together. The last entry was dated just a month before his death. "Margaret brought me soup and sat with me while I worked on the satellite calculations. Still the best partner an engineer could ask for." Among his business papers, I discovered detailed documentation of my contributions to his work. Charles had meticulously recorded every late night I'd spent reviewing contracts, every suggestion I'd made that improved his designs, every client meeting where my insights had helped close a deal. He'd been building a case for our partnership long before Victoria's betrayal, preserving evidence of my integral role in our shared success. One document particularly moved me, a letter to the patent office nominating me as co-inventor on his final design. Charles had submitted it just weeks before his death, ensuring that history would record my contributions to the work that had made our fortune possible. The complexity of Charles's protective plan became even more apparent as I worked with Morrison to understand the full scope of the estate. Charles had been quietly restructuring assets for months, moving funds into trusts that would be difficult for Victoria to challenge. He'd established what he called legacy accounts, separate funds designated for specific purposes that reflected our shared values. One account was designated for a scholarship program we discussed creating for first-generation college students in engineering. Another was set aside for the preservation of the small historical aerospace museum in Denver where we'd first met. Charles had been giving a lecture there on satellite technology, and I'd been auditing the talk as part of my continuing education program. But the most touching discovery was a trust Charles had established specifically for our housekeeper, Maria Santos. Maria had worked for us for 15 years, becoming like family. Charles had secretly set aside $250,000 to ensure her retirement security, along with a letter expressing our gratitude for her loyalty and care during his illness. "Maria," the letter read, "Margaret and I have watched you give your heart to caring for our home and our family. This is not charity. It's recognition of the value you've brought to our lives. Please use this to pursue your dream of opening the bakery you've talked about, or simply to enjoy the retirement you've earned." Maria cried when I presented her with the trust documents. She'd had no idea Charles had been planning this gift, and her joy at being remembered and valued touched my heart deeply. The investigation also revealed how thoroughly Charles had been planning his protection strategy. He'd been working with Morrison for nearly a year, not just on the estate addendum, but on what he called contingency protocols. These included detailed instructions for how to handle various scenarios if Victoria contested the will, contact information for key witnesses, and even a communication plan to ensure I wouldn't be left isolated during any legal proceedings. Charles had identified every weak point in Victoria's potential strategy and had prepared countermeasures. He documented her financial troubles, her pattern of manipulation, and even her attempts to access his medical records without authorization. It was like reading the playbook of a master strategist who'd anticipated every possible move his opponent might make. Morrison showed me a timeline Charles had created, mapping out Victoria's increasing involvement in estate planning alongside her escalating financial problems. The correlation was unmistakable. As her debt grew and her divorce proceedings intensified, her interest in helping with our estate planning had increased dramatically. "Your husband was 3 steps ahead of her the entire time," Morrison told me. "He let her think she was manipulating him while he was actually gathering evidence of her manipulation. It was brilliant, really." But the most revealing document was a private letter Charles had written to Morrison, to be opened only if Victoria attempted to contest the estate. "Margaret has been my partner in every success I've achieved. She possesses a sharp analytical mind that complemented my technical skills perfectly. Our marriage was never about traditional roles. It was about 2 intelligent people building something together." Victoria's assumption that Margaret is incompetent reveals more about Victoria's prejudices than about Margaret's capabilities. If you're reading this, it means Victoria has underestimated my wife. That was her first mistake. Protecting Margaret was my final project, and I approached it with the same methodical precision I brought to my engineering work. The house feels different now, lighter somehow, though I've changed nothing. Charles's books still line the hallway shelves. His coffee mug still sits in the cabinet. His reading glasses remain on the nightstand, waiting for Saturday mornings that will never come. But the shadow that had fallen over everything during those final months has lifted. The tension I couldn't name, the feeling that I was being quietly erased from my own life, that's gone. Last week, I received a letter from David, Charles's son, and Victoria's ex-husband. He'd heard about the will controversy through mutual friends and wanted to apologize for his mother's actions. He'd suspected something was wrong when Victoria insisted on helping with estate planning but hadn't known the extent of her scheme. "Dad loved you completely," he wrote. "He used to say you were the smartest person he ever met, that you saw patterns and solutions he couldn't. I think he knew exactly what Victoria was planning, and he played the long game to protect you. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that made him successful." David was right. Charles had seen Victoria's true nature long before I'd allowed myself to acknowledge it. He'd protected me the only way he could, with patience, documentation, and a trust in justice that I'd nearly lost. The most surprising revelation came from Frank Morrison, Charles's old business partner. He contacted me a month after the will reading to share something Charles had told him privately. During one of their last conversations, Charles had mentioned being concerned about Victoria's influence, but said he was taking care of things. He winked when he said it, Frank told me, like he was enjoying a private joke. I think he knew all along what she was planning, and he was already 3 steps ahead. The Aerospace Museum unveiled Charles's memorial wing last month. I stood in the lobby, surrounded by displays of satellite guidance systems and space exploration history, watching young engineers examine Charles's innovations with wonder. Victoria wasn't there, of course. She'd moved to Seattle shortly after the legal challenges failed, starting over with what remained of her reputation. But I was there, and Charles's legacy was there, and the future we'd built together continues to reach toward the stars. I've established a scholarship fund for young women pursuing engineering degrees, something Charles and I had discussed but never implemented. The first recipient is a brilliant 19-year-old from Tucson who's designing solar panel systems for Mars missions. When I met her at the awards ceremony, she reminded me of myself at that age, determined, optimistic, ready to change the world alongside someone who believed in her potential. The scholarship program has grown beyond my initial vision. We now support 12 students annually, and I've partnered with 3 universities to provide mentorship programs. Last month, I spoke at a Women in Engineering conference, sharing the story of how Charles and I built our partnership and encouraging young women to demand recognition for their contributions. Standing at that podium, looking out at faces filled with the same determination I'd once felt, I realized that Victoria's betrayal had inadvertently given me something valuable, a platform to speak about the importance of partnership, recognition, and standing up for what's right. The conference presentation led to invitations to speak at other events, and I found myself becoming an unexpected advocate for recognizing women's contributions in male-dominated fields. My story resonated with audiences because it highlighted how easily women's work can be overlooked or minimized, even within their own families. One particularly moving response came from a young engineer named Rachel Kim, who approached me after a presentation at Arizona State University. She told me that hearing my story had given her the courage to insist on credit for her contributions to a major project where her male supervisor had been taking sole credit for her ideas. "I realized I was letting someone else write the story of my work," Rachel told me. "Your example showed me that I have the right to claim my achievements and the responsibility to document my contributions so they can't be erased." These interactions have become one of the most rewarding aspects of my new life. Charles's legacy isn't just preserved in patents and investments. It lives on in the young minds we're supporting and the conversations we're starting about partnership and recognition. I've also become involved with legal reform efforts aimed at preventing estate manipulation. Working with Morrison and other attorneys, I've helped develop educational materials for families facing end-of-life planning, highlighting warning signs of manipulation and providing resources for protection. The materials include Charles's story as a case study in how to protect vulnerable family members from exploitation. His methodical approach to documenting evidence and creating safeguards has become a model for other families facing similar situations. Morrison has told me that the case has changed how his firm approaches estate planning. They now routinely include provisions for independent witnesses and documentation requirements that make manipulation more difficult. Other law firms have adopted similar practices, creating a ripple effect of improved protection for vulnerable clients. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome has been the relationships I've built with other women who've faced similar challenges. Through my speaking engagements and advocacy work, I've connected with dozens of women who've had their contributions minimized or their legacies threatened by family members who saw them as obstacles rather than partners. These women have become a support network and a source of strength. We share strategies for protecting ourselves and our work, and we celebrate each other's victories in claiming recognition and respect. It's a community I never expected to join, but one that has enriched my life immeasurably. Last year, we formalized our network into a nonprofit organization called the Partnership Legacy Foundation. Our mission is to support women whose contributions to family enterprises have been overlooked or threatened, providing legal resources, emotional support, and advocacy for recognition. The foundation has already helped 12 women in its first year, providing legal assistance to contest unfair estate distributions and supporting efforts to document women's contributions to family businesses and intellectual property. One of our first success stories involved a woman whose late husband's business partners were trying to buy out her shares at a fraction of their value, claiming she lacked the expertise to remain involved in the company. With our support, she was able to demonstrate her integral role in building the business and secured fair compensation for her ownership stake. Another case involved a widow whose stepchildren were challenging her inheritance, claiming their father had been manipulated into leaving assets to his gold-digger wife. Our legal team helped document the couple's 25-year partnership and the woman's significant contributions to building their shared wealth. The challenge was withdrawn when faced with overwhelming evidence of the wife's legitimate role in the marriage. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Charles hadn't been suspicious, if he'd trusted Victoria's manipulations, if Morrison hadn't been there to document the truth. I think about all the ways grief can be weaponized, how vulnerability can be mistaken for weakness, how quietly a life's work can be stolen by someone wearing a smile and speaking the language of family. But Charles knew better. He knew that real partnership means protecting each other, even from dangers the other person can't see coming. He knew that love isn't just about the good times. It's about making sure the story continues truthfully after one voice falls silent. I'm 71 years old now, living alone in a house overlooking the desert Charles loved. But I'm not lonely, and I'm certainly not powerless. I have his letters, his laughter echoing in every room, and the knowledge that our story ended exactly as it should have, with truth, justice, and a love that survived even death. Victoria thought she could rewrite our history, delete my chapters, claim the ending for herself. She was wrong. The best stories are the ones where the quiet heroes find their voices, where patience defeats greed, and where love wins, not through grand gestures, but through careful preparation and faith in what's right. Charles's final gift wasn't just the estate. It was the reminder that I'd never been the fragile widow Victoria thought she could manipulate. I was the woman who'd helped build an empire, who'd stood beside a genius and contributed my own intelligence to our shared success. I was the co-author of our story, and I always had been. The laughter Morrison couldn't contain that day in the conference room? It was the sound of a beautiful plan finally coming to light, the moment when Charles's faith in justice proved stronger than Victoria's faith in deception. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting the truth speak for itself. And sometimes, the people who underestimate quiet strength learn too late that still waters run deeper than they ever imagined. What would you have done if someone tried to erase you from your own life story? How far would you go to protect what you'd built with someone you loved? Share your thoughts below, because every family has secrets, but not every family has someone brave enough to bring them to light.